Hello and welcome. Wonderful to have you here. Today what I want to do is to discuss 3 lessons and 2 practices that I've taken from our recent house fire. Some of you will know that I had a house fire. My wife and I had a house fire several weeks ago, and trying to overcome all of these issues, work our way through it, there's a number of things that I've learned, a number of practices that I've found useful, and the whole point of these videos, the whole point of this channel of mine on YouTube, as some of you will have remembered me speaking about many times in the past, is to live wiser and kinder and calmer lives. Well, one important part of that is wisdom, and there is a lot of wisdom to be gained in an experience like this, so that we don't let it go to waste. So today I'll discuss these things that I've learned and these practices that I've found useful. First, let's discuss 3 lessons. In one of the Buddha's early sermons, he talks about what he terms the mass of suffering, the mass of suffering that we have to go through in our ordinary lives. And in one passage about that, he talks about the sort of ordinary layperson, the lay gentleman, and what he has to go through. And the Buddha says, "That gentleman might try hard, strive, and make an effort, and succeed in earning money. But they experience pain and sadness when they try to protect it, thinking, 'How can I prevent my wealth from being taken by rulers or bandits, consumed by fire, swept away by flood, or taken by unloved heirs?' And even though they protect it and ward it, rulers or bandits take it, or fire consumes it, or flood sweeps it away, or unloved heirs take it. They sorrow and wail and lament, beating their breast and falling into confusion. What used to be mine is gone. This too is a drawback of sensual pleasures, apparent in this very life, a mass of suffering caused by sensual pleasures." So there's lots to talk about here. First of all, the Buddha's essentially getting at the point that lay people, householders, are expected to protect their wealth. It's not only that they do protect their wealth, but for the Buddha, they're expected to. That's part of the duty of the householder. But that protection can be difficult and is not always successful. So the first lesson is to have insurance. There wasn't really insurance of this kind in the Buddha's day, but many of us in our societies are lucky enough to have access to insurance products, and fortunately my wife and I had good insurance. So knock on wood, I mean, you can never be sure about these things until they're all finished, but knock on wood, we should be able to recoup our losses, that our insurance will cover the losses that we've had to go through during this fire process. And so I'd recommend, as our first lesson, is to have insurance. Whether you have homeowner's insurance or renter's insurance doesn't matter so much, but you want to have something that will pay you back in the case of a loss that you really couldn't afford otherwise. Now, insurance will cover us for material losses, but there also are immaterial losses having to do with, let's say, our intellectual property. So, for example, I had a lot of material on my hard drives, on my computer at home, in my office, and the fire, as I said in a recent video, I'll leave a link to that video down below, the fire happened right above my desk, which had all my computer stuff on it. I wasn't able to get any of that out of there because there was literally fire raining down on it when I was in the room trying to put the fire out and wasn't able to. So all of that was burned. If I had not had a backup in the cloud, I would have lost literally everything. I would have lost all of my papers. I would have lost all of my material for videos and everything else. So our second lesson here is to have a backup in the cloud. As people say, have at least two forms of backup. One form of backup you have locally. That is to say, if you're using an Apple, you have a Time Machine backup. If you're not using Apple, you have another kind of backup that's local to you, so that in case your hard drive dies, you will have something that's very easy for you to immediately start working again. However, it's vitally important for you also to have a second backup that's not local, that's up in the cloud, that's something that's done automatically. Now, I use Backblaze. This is not sponsored by them. I don't have any affiliation with them at all, but I use them because they're relatively easy to use, and it does it automatically, so I don't have to think about it. When I was trying to get everything back together after the fire, I went to a local computer place, and the guy told me of a story about a local person who was a photographer. And this person had years and years, perhaps even a lifetime, of photographs that they had quote-unquote backed up by keeping them on hard drives and putting them in a supposedly fireproof safe in their house. Now, the safe may well have been fireproof, but when their house, as happens, when their house actually did burn down, the fire was sufficiently hot that it destroyed the material in that fireproof safe, which is a lesson to us. They lost years, decades, perhaps even, I don't know, a lifetime worth of work. The upshot here is that you should always keep a second backup that's off-site. And of course, it's, we can do that by taking an actual physical hard drive and moving it somewhere else, but we're not going to do that regularly because that's a lot of work. It's much easier to have something that does it automatically so that we don't have to think about it. That way it'll be done whether or not we're remembering to do it. Now, the third lesson is the most important, and that has to do with personal safety. And the lesson is to have working smoke detectors. That was something that, to be honest, I had done, although I was second-guessing my decision to do so many times before the fire happened. Indeed, I had a smoke detector, as is clear from the story, in my office. That was the smoke detector that went off. And I had thought to myself, why do I have a smoke detector in this office? There's nobody who is sleeping here. There's nobody who's living here, that is to say, in the office, who's, not going to be aware of what's going on. There are no open flames here. There's no obvious source of combustion. Why don't I just not have a smoke detector in my office, and then I won't have to deal with it when it goes off at 2 in the morning and nothing's the problem? Well, if that smoke detector hadn't been there, we might not have survived. We were told by the fire inspector, who has inspected many fires like these in the past, that oftentimes what happens is that the fire isn't necessarily that big, but the smoke and indeed the carbon monoxide gets around the house very quickly, and carbon monoxide is not, it's odorless. We don't notice it when it's out, and all that it produces is kind of a sense of euphoria. But if we're half asleep or even fully asleep, we may simply never wake up because the carbon monoxide gets to a level where it renders us unconscious, and of course, carbon monoxide is a poison, so it eventually kills people, even if the fire is not particularly big in the house at the time. So having that smoke detector in that room that worked, that woke us up or got us out of bed, was critical. And if this video can help even one person to, recover their material goods or their intellectual property or survive, this video will definitely have been worth it 1,000 times to have produced. So that would be our third lesson, is working smoke detectors. Now, as to practices, there are a couple of practices that I've found particularly useful and worthwhile during this period. The first, and of course, and I leave aside the ordinary practice of mindfulness meditation, which I do daily and is always useful. These are practices that are specifically useful in situations like these that are difficult. The first of these practices, well, let's go back to a very famous early sutta of the Buddha's called the Buddha's Advice to Sigalika, which is perhaps his most complete set of advice, reams of advice that he gives to a layperson. I did actually, in my course over at the Online Dharma Institute, I have one course called Work, Money, and Pleasure, where I discuss the Buddha's advice to lay people, and I spend several lectures going over this wonderful sutta. But in that sutta, he talks about, among other things, the importance of having good friends. And he mentions how part of what it is to have a good friend is that you have someone who will protect you from danger and save you from various kinds of loss, that they will give you aid in times that you need it. And we are very, very fortunate in having lots of good friends and neighbors around us. Indeed, the night of the fire, we were basically out on the street, as it were, at 1 o'clock in the morning, and one of our neighbors, in fact, she was coming back from the airport with her daughter and a daughter's friend, and the daughter's friend came to my wife and me and asked if we wanted to come to their house and spend the night there. And eventually we spent 2 nights there, after which we went and spent 3 nights with a different neighbor. It was a bit of time, but as these things happen, our fire was on a Friday night and a long weekend, so it ended up taking longer than it might otherwise for the insurance to get everything back together for us and all the rest. Also, that night of the fire, the Red Cross came up to us, a person from the Red Cross, and had a bunch of material for us and asked if we needed a place to stay for the night. Fortunately, we were with this neighbor, so we didn't, but this is just goes to show the importance of having good friends and neighbors. So what then is the practice? Well, the practice that I've gone through and enjoyed is a practice of gratitude and metta, or loving kindness. Gratitude or loving kindness is so important to us in difficult times, because even in difficult times, I think virtually all of us will almost always find that there are helpers, people out there trying to lend a hand, trying to do what's right. And if we focus only on the difficulty, on the problems, on the pain and suffering, then we're going to be beaten down. Whereas if we turn our minds in a more positive direction towards kindness, towards gratitude, that will, I think, make our lives better, make the whole situation easier. And of course, I'm so grateful to the people who have donated to me through PayPal, through joining Patreon, for to help out, as well as to get things in return, because we have wonderful things on Patreon. Those are all people who really make this work of mine worthwhile and show the good-heartedness of so many of you, indeed all of you who watch these videos and comment and give thumbs ups and all the rest of the things that we expect on YouTube, right? Another practice which I've found useful is that which the Buddha alludes to in his discussion of this mass of suffering. That is an awareness of the dangers, the drawbacks in attachment to physical things and attachment to sense pleasures generally. That these attachments that bring in their wake this mass of suffering. They bring problems with them. That is to say that while losing resources, books, articles, that is difficult for me, I have to admit. A lot of the stuff that was in the house that has to be discarded now because of smoke damage or fire damage, a lot of that stuff is, at the end of the day, just stuff. It's stuff that in the back of my mind I was aware, look, we're going to have to discard this stuff eventually, we're going to have to get rid of it somehow. We don't need all of this stuff. And so, in a sense, there are aspects of the fire that are cleansing. And it's through these Buddhist practices of the awareness of the dangers of attachment to possessions and attachment to sense pleasures that I see that these are things to be discarded eventually, that these are things to be overcome eventually. And that has helped in a great deal for me, and indeed for my wife, who also practices, both of us, to feel relatively okay with losing a lot of stuff that has to be thrown away. Just because we can't keep it anymore, it's fire damaged or smoke damaged. And I know that because we've talked to friends and family who have very different responses, or would have, and so they're surprised at our relative equanimity in the situation. But in any event, the Buddha talks about, sorrowing and wailing and lamenting due to losses from fire and floods and other things. And I don't find myself sorrowing or wailing or lamenting an awful lot, really. A little bit now and then, but not as much as you might think from reading what the Buddha had to say. Now, of course, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we did have good insurance, that we do have good friends and neighbors, that neither of us died or was seriously injured because we had smoke detectors and we had backups for material online. So we had taken certain kinds of precautions. But still, I think the process is helped by doing these kinds of practices. There are a number of practices and approaches to life that are particularly useful to us, that are particularly advantageous, that produce wisdom by producing calm and keeping us being kind to one another. And indeed, I did a video about just such a list of practices associated indeed with my book that I wrote recently, which is now out in physical form. It's back there on the windowsill, a copy of it. And I'll leave a link to the video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it. Thanks so much to all of you for watching. Thanks again from the bottom of my heart to all of my supporters over on Patreon and all of you for watching and commenting and being such a great audience. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.